Howdy everyone. Alright, so like I said in my last video, I think for now I'm going to call the avionics complete. Of course, we all know that that's not entirely accurate because there's a lot of engine system things that still need to be wired in, like CHTs, EGTs, oil, things like that. So all of that's still going to have to be wired once I get the engine in. But for now, the core actual avionics, the flight avionics, if you will, I'm going to call them done. So I'm moving on to working the rest of this panel to completion. So you can see that I've got everything labeled with a Sharpie. I'm going to make sure that I get at least a picture of this panel just like it is, so that I can go back after the fact, look at the picture, and start figuring out exactly how I want everything labeled. So I'm going to do that first. I'll get a picture of this, make sure that I've got the labels, the markings for the labels captured, and then I'm going to strip everything off of this panel, and I'm going to prep it for paint. There's not going to be a whole lot to talk about with that, just because I'm not doing anything fancy. I'm not doing anything complicated. I am literally just going to clean the panel off, sand it a little bit to get rid of the shine, and prime it with a spray can, paint it with a spray can, and that's it for now. Ultimately, I'll put the decals on, or the different labels will go on, and then I'll clear coat over top of the labels. But that will probably be a little ways down the road. So for today, clean this off, sand it, prime it, paint it. Don't know that I'll document much of that because it's pretty straightforward stuff. After I'm done with that, I'm going to go back to the wiring. The last time that I was out here in the shop, I finished up running the one wire for the left wing fuel sender. So that wire is now part of this bundle. I still have to do the right side. I have it partially run, but I have to run it down this bulkhead here, down that vertical bulkhead, and along the bottom here through the spar. Let me get my finger in the picture here. Down the vertical, across, through the spar, and then out. And in order to do that, I have to cut some of my my black wax cord that I use to tie all this up. I have to cut those loose and run the wire and rewrap stuff. So that's the kind of stuff I'll be doing today after I get the panel done. The exciting news, at least for me, after that, right? So after the panel is painted and after I get that one last wire run, I'm going to move on to doing the fiberglass fairings for the tail. So I don't have any of my tail pieces in here. They are in the basement, but I'm going to start with the vertical stabilizer because that's a very small fiberglass cap, if you will. I'm going to start with that, and I'm going to go through the process of installing that, and then I'll move on to the other fairings. But I'm going to do all of I guess they're called fairings. I think of them more like tips, almost like, the vertical stabilizer tip, the rudder tip, the bottom rudder, whatever. The fiberglass pieces parts. I'm going to start those next, and that will ultimately include wing tips. Where's my wings? Over here somewhere. That will ultimately include the zip tips, installation, and things of that nature. So I'm looking forward to that, just because, just like with everything else, right? I was super jacked to work on the engine, but after a while I was tired of engines. I was tired of oil and stuff. I loved working on the fuselage, but eventually I got tired of aluminum and drilling holes and deburring, right? Then I was working on the canopy. I got fed up with plastic. Then I moved on to wiring. I was super jacked about that, but now I've had it. So I'm excited to move on to something else. So that's the plan. Panel. One last wire for now. Fiberglass. All right, guys. Thanks for stopping in. I will talk to you later. Howdy, everyone. Well, you can see that I've got my instrument panel now cleaned, primed, and painted. I use the hammered bronze spray paint that I like so much. The finish is okay. I am not an expert at painting hammered finish with a spray can. So it's not incredibly uniform across the surface of the instrument panel. There are some areas that are more hammered, I guess, than others. I guess the paint went on heavier and the hammered texture is a little bit more intense, a little bit more apparent than some of the other spots. So it has a little bit of an inconsistent finish to it, but I'm still happy with it overall. I'm sure it will be fine once it gets repopulated with all of its stuff and it gets installed in the airplane. So I'm not going to lose sleep over it quite yet. So this is going to sit and dry. In the meantime, I'm going to start figuring out what size and what style labels I want to put on it. And I think I'll do a test piece just to make sure that the clear that I want to spray over top of it will not affect the stickers, the labels. So that's to come. What I'm working on now are the fiberglass tips for the elevators. The instructions don't tell you a whole lot about working with and installing these fiberglass tips, mainly because there's not a whole lot to them. The instructions do say that they recommend you start with the elevator, the two elevators and the rudder first to get those fitted, and then with the elevators and rudder fitted to their horizontal and vertical stabilizers, you can work on the tips for those components. But they do recommend you start with the elevators and the rudder. So that's what I'm going to do. So I believe this is the left elevator here. Of course, this is the left and right fiberglass tips are identical. They do note on, if you look at the actual print, they do note notching this to clear the counterweight. However, when you look at the setup inside, you've got the skin here, and then you've got the rib behind it. So there's a step right here between the rib and the skin. Now the fiberglass tip, this area here is actually longer than what's shown here. I've already cut this one. This flange here sticks out quite a bit. And what happens is when you go to fit this onto the elevator, that the edge of that flange will ride up onto this rib. And if you have done like I have done, the rib itself is also fluted. So you've got these high spots on it. So when you go to fit the tip onto there, it's going to want to ride up onto this flange on both sides here and on this side up here. And that leaves a pretty nasty gap between the actual skin and the actual tip itself. So to alleviate that, you can cut this flange back, which I just did. So now this flange is only as wide as this gap here between this edge of the skin and the edge of the flange. But you can see, hopefully, there is next to zero edge distance between the edge of this rib flange right here, and the holes. So that's an issue, especially with this being fiberglass. So there are multiple solutions, and as you may know, I am striving to build a super lightweight airplane, so I didn't want to start adding aluminum doublers or aluminum flanges and nut plates and extra rivets and things like that. So what I've elected to do, the instructions tell you that these are held in place with CS4 pop rivets. So this is not really intended to be removed. So what I'm going to do is I've cut this flange down. I'm going to go ahead and fit it. I'm going to mark the holes onto the tip. I'm going to drill the holes. I'll probably have 0 edge distance. But when I go to do the final assembly, this onto the elevator, I am going to put some fuel tank sealant on here. And the fuel tank sealant will help with holding it in place. It will hopefully strengthen it a little bit. If any of the holes do crack on the fiberglass, the fuel tank sealant will help mitigate the risk of the tip itself actually coming loose and continue to vibrate and shatter. So that's the plan that I'm going to do. In hindsight, I may have elected to not even dimple these and just attach this with fuel tank sealant, period. But that is not the case. Yes, I could come back and try to undimple these and, then fill them in and all that nonsense, which I'm not going to get into. So that's the plan. I'm going to fit this like I have it, drill it, fuel tank seal it, put it on. When this is in place, you still have access to the counterweight. You can still drill your counterweight, remove material in here, and you also have some access here, and you also have limited access back here. So there's plenty of areas to remove material from the counterweight after the tip is installed so that you can balance the elevator. They recommend balancing your components after they're painted. So obviously the tip has to be installed. So, all right. Next thing is my setup for cutting the fiberglass. So I've done this kind of setup before. I had done it originally when I was installing wingtip lights in the original wingtips. I used this kind of setup to cut the fiberglass wingtips, but I've since moved on to the zip tips and sold my originals. So I just got a run-of-the-mill dust collector, and I've got my tubing run from it to this funnel, which is clamped to my bench. I'm using a Dremel to actually do the cutting, and wearing a dust mask and all your PPE. I just do all my cutting right over top of this funnel, and it takes care of the majority of the fiberglass particles. And I've got my air filter unit up here that's running. So I'm fairly safe, right? I've got an air filtration system. I've got a dust collector. I work over top of the funnel, and I'm wearing personally on my body my PPE. So that's how I'm doing that. I'm going to get back into this tip here. I'm going to completely finish this tip. By that, I mean I'm going to trim it, sand it, fit it, file it, countersink it, all of that stuff to get it fit, to make sure that all of my different operations are working good enough. And then I'll go ahead and move on to the other ones. So let me get back into this, and I will talk to you guys later.